I've never had a direct working relationship with Howard White, unlike many of the speakers here. In fact, today is the first time that I shake Howard White's hand, and I meet him personally. But as it happens in the world of development studies and research, we sort of come to know people through their work, and this is how I came to know of many of Howard White's contributions. But with this presentation, we're sort of going to move from the macro level analysis, to which he has contributed a lot, to the much more micro level analysis, and particularly to questions of poverty analysis and research methodology, which did influence some of my work at the time, and particularly on the specific topic that I'm going to talk about here. Before I move onto the presentation, I would like also to give some of my anecdotal background in my engagement with Howard's research. In 2002, I was working for the Ministry of Planning and Finance in Mozambique in one of its research units, essentially working on poverty analysis and the poverty reduction strategy papers. And at the same time, I was also deeply immersed in the process of data collection on rural labor in this project that has been mentioned before. And at the time, obviously, working in the government, it was quite hard to get access to academic publications. I was pretty much detached from the academic world, but I did have my network of contacts who every now and then would send me papers. So I remember when 2002 paper published by Howard in World Development on combining qualitative and quantitative approaches for poverty analysis was sent to me. And it was sent to me at a particularly important time. I was losing battles against some of my colleagues in the Ministry of Planning and Finance about the data collection process for the second National Household Survey. I was losing battles with the National Statistics Office about their definitions of the household and how they went about the collection of information on consumption, household consumption. And of course, Howard's paper was quite timely, because I could say, well, there's this very well-established scholar, it's not me saying it, who argues that there are some serious problems with some of the poverty analysis and the assumptions that are made, which are embedded in much of the poverty profiles that proliferate nowadays as key inputs into the poverty reduction strategy papers. Anyway, of course, I was ignored, and the National Household Survey was not changed. The parameters, existing parameters prevailed, and eventually the government of Mozambique paid the price with fairly unreliable and non-robust poverty data in 2003 and 2008 later on, and had to make sense of poverty trends, which didn't really make much sense to a lot of people. Anyway, so that's for the background. So that paper was important. In fact, it is one of the core readings I always give to my students in my research methodology courses, especially those who are interested in carrying out some sort of quantitative survey. So what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is basically it's going to be organized around three blocks. One, some broad reflections about the value of quantitative and qualitative synergies and some of these on the challenges in establishing that sort of dialogue. Then I will zoom in and focus more on the problematics of the concept of the household and how that affects our poverty analysis and indeed our survey design. And then I will illustrate some ways we found, I've had some 15 years experience in data collection essentially on poverty and rural labor issues in different countries. And we've come up with some changes and possible innovations which may not be replicable in all contexts, but may help in terms of addressing some of the challenges that come with problematic notions of the household. So let me start with the sort of broader reflections on the value of mixed methods to improve our service design. First, the very obvious point, I think, to many in this audience is that understanding a complex phenomenon like poverty and its dynamics does require combining methods more than the application of single method gold standards. I think there's more and more evidence that's the case. It doesn't mean that the profession goes into this direction, because the challenges are important. Certainly, quantitative and qualitative approaches to understand some key development changes like poverty reduction, rural development, agricultural development, and so on, can work both in opposition and in dialogue. Indeed, there has been a lot of opposition, particularly those working in poverty, when finding that the results of participatory poverty surveys, for example, were contradictory with the results of poverty quantitative household surveys. And that is always been, that sort of tension has always been there, and I guess it's always going to be there. Howard makes an important point in that paper, which is the real opposition is not so much about quantitative and qualitative, it really is about data analysis versus data mining. And I would argue that is an important point because a lot of the research on poverty, unfortunately, has been characterized by a lot of data mining, and indeed a lot of what some of the researchers call false precision. Now, research on poverty is generally often constrained by untested assumptions, and I'm going to talk about more precisely about assumptions that are made about the household. Many of these assumptions do directly relate to basics of the conceptualization of the levels and the units of analysis. And the units of analysis are central to our understanding of poverty trends, whether we talk about individuals, we talk about households, or we try to derive information about individuals from information that has been collected at the household level. And that is at the heart of some of the conundrums that Howard addressed. So one of the big conundrums is the relationship between poverty and household size, and whether household size and composition matters for poverty status. And part of this is related to these competing theses about whether larger households are poorer or smaller households are poorer. And that's one of the things that I liked most of Howard's paper when I was reading it, how he engaged with anthropological research, which consistently shows anyone who spent more than 2 hours reading some ethnographic research on rural Africa would know that usually it is larger households that are richer, okay? And that is because access to labor is the key thing to understand socioeconomic status in areas where poverty is widespread. And that goes against the 99% of the poverty profiles constructed on the basis of national household surveys, which show the opposite. So, of course, one of the key issues, Howard advances a number of hypotheses. A key issue is the notion of household economies of scale, and say something that also the World Bank researchers suggested earlier, which is one important assumption underpinning the conventional application of a per capita measure of income consumption, is that there exists no economies of size in consumption. And that is a problem that mars a lot of data collection. People sometimes forget that consumption data for poverty profiles are derived from single responses, usually from the household head about the household consumption, but then the poverty profiles are based on per capita consumption. And this is a major problem if some of these assumptions do not hold. The bottom line is that most statisticians in these national agencies always ignore this kind of discussion. Why? Because it does complicate their job enormously. I would argue that if I look at my own experience in collecting data on rural labor issues, this is crucial not only for questions about consumption, but also for questions about what people do to survive and on what basis households reproduce themselves. So labor market outcomes will depend a lot on what kind of definition of the household and how we broaden or not our definition of the household. So it does also matter for poverty analysis through the employment nexus. Let me just give you an example. Howard went on to analyzing this in another separate paper in 2003 with Eduardo Masset. And there's an interesting figure here which shows the important discrepancy between the results assuming a certain degree of economies of scale in household consumption or not assuming them. And you can compare the data from the World Bank, which basically assume no economies of scale and therefore a positive relationship between household size and poverty, headcount index, and different assumptions about this and how this relationship really breaks down as soon as you use a different assumption. And this different assumption is perfectly plausible in quite a wide range of contexts. So it is not a trivial finding, it is something that does affect, it goes into the heart of our understanding of poverty. It does raise a number of key questions. So anyone who's been involved in direct data collection for different types of issues and projects may have had to address some of these questions about the household. And of course, anthropologists always address these questions. Takes me to this notion of the myth of the African family comes from the title of a book chapter written by Bridget O'Loughlin in 1995 in a book on gender and poverty and agriculture in Africa. And she demolishes a lot of the assumptions that are usually made in much of the conventional research on gender in Africa, and does raise some important questions about how, our notions of the household. So there's very simple, concrete questions that need to be asked. Who is included and who is not, and why? So how do you go about the household roster? There isn't a golden rule. Is there a common acceptable notion of the household in a particular national context and more specifically in local context? Is this term consistently understood by respondents or even by the enumerators who are involved in data collection? Of course not. Different people will have different notions of the household depending on where they're coming from. Another burning question, who is the household head and why? What defines headship in households? Variety of responses. Can a household be divided into independent components even if there are conjugal ties or when they're not? Questions that need to be empirically tested. Do polygamous households constitute one or various units? I will go into more details on this because for those of us who've done research, for example, in countries like Senegal, it is a major issue. What does this common pot really mean? Which is frequently mentioned in the standard residential definitions of the household. How does the reference period we use for the residential criteria affect household membership? Whether we use 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, who is included and excluded depending on the time reference period. And how is the variation, on a very important point that Bridget made at that time, variation in conjugal relations intertwined with class differentiation in rural areas, i.e. class and poverty are indeed linked to access to labor, and therefore they also link to the relationship between household size and composition and poverty. So these questions are still in the air. A lot of people have tried, certainly not the National Statistics Institute, they still stick to the usual parameters and conventions, but a lot of researchers are trying to grapple with some of these big questions. And interestingly, some research has been done in recent years, and particularly by a group of researchers and the World Bank, through experiments that do indeed show why these questions matter. So let me just give you a few examples of research that has been done in recent years that give us a lot of food for thought. Some of the experiments, some of them are published in a paper by Beeman and Dillon in Journal of Development Studies, I think, which was also drawing partly on work by Chris Audrey. First thing they say, we all know that household remains something of a black box for economists. Okay? It is not for many anthropologists indeed. Experiments with different definitions led indeed to variations in both household size and composition. So different ways of asking questions, different household roster modules did have an impact in this very important variable that is at the heart of the poverty profiles. There were significant implications, they argue, for household level consumption, surprise, surprise, even asset statistics, and per adult equivalent agricultural production. But then they raise a conundrum, which is, on the one hand, you need a consistent household definition in order to make comparisons over time in a given population and across populations. That is sort of the kind of imperative that many statisticians and economists tend to face. But also over time, for a given population, the definition must identify the correct economic or decision-making unit, which may in fact differ according to the research question. So that is an interesting, and that has also raised all sorts of debates within the bank about how to improve household survey design, since the bank is a major funder, but also a major provider of technical assistance for household surveys. There's also another group of researchers, and there's the website there, Household Survey Info, Sandra Randall and Ernestina Coast. They started with a project on Tanzania, and they've told me recently that they've scaled up to 5 countries, in which they look at these questions, how these different definitions work in different contexts and how they affect our understanding of poverty and other questions. So in the context of Tanzania, for example, they contrast these very different realities, areas dominated by Maasai groups, where you have interdependent groups that are split up in surveys, in fact, but they are considered by themselves to be one economic unit of production and consumption. In Dar es Salaam, peri-urban areas, observe a very high mobility, especially of children and youth, in between households. So the timing of the household survey will be important. And refugees, straightforward livelihoods with extremely complex ways of living. So you have a subsistence economy with several members contributing to household finances, some of whom are actually not included in the standard definitions. They also say that there's no local word for household, which suggests that this is indeed not an easy concept. And they come up with a typology in which you have what they call open households and closed households, and pretty much, standard household surveys tend to capture the closed households much better than the open households, which raises a problem of a systematic bias. Another work by Akers and Edmonds also show the extreme fluidity of households, with 10% of individuals spending some time away over a 3-year period, averaging 16 to 36 months away. That has serious implications because a lot of these people will be simply out of the residential definition of the household. And if these people are important contributors to the household wealth or well-being, then this is going to have implications on our characterization of poverty for these groups. So this is for some of the studies that I've seen in recent years, which I think are going in the right direction in asking important questions. Let me now zoom in into two separate types of problems, which are not always about the questions raised by these studies. One is the missing people. So what sorts of missing people we need to take into account in order to adapt our survey techniques to make sure that we capture all of them, or at least most of them. First of all, obviously fluid households, the blur rural-urban boundaries, something has to be done, which affects the reference period and so on and so forth. There are contexts in which strict residential systems, registration systems in context of labor migration do affect who is included and who is not, who is considered as rural and urban. I'm thinking of millions of migrants in urban and China, in Vietnam, who are essentially still registered in rural areas through the hukou system. How are they captured by surveys, and how this allows us to understand process of migration and poverty reduction. In many areas of Africa, seasonal migrants constitute quite important constituents, especially in dynamic agro-export areas. These areas are not randomly distributed, so it is also quite easy to miss them. The same goes for nomadic or pastoralist populations in areas of different countries, quite important in countries like Ethiopia, who are persistently and consistently missed out in household surveys. Fragile, disjointed, or split households where there is endemic violence, and very often people are missed out because of the situations in these particular households. And then, of course, people who are just missing because they are outside the definition of what is a household, i.e. anyone who is homeless, people living, sleeping in institutions, hostels, workers' dormitories. We found a lot of these in our research, especially in dynamic agro-export areas. They will never be visited by enumerators of national statistics agencies. Slum populations, very hard to navigate slums and find people using very conventional definition of the household. And indeed, people in areas posing security risks. Roy Carhill, he's written also recently another paper on the problems with censuses, and he does address some of these issues in his paper and how many people are actually missing from censuses. Then polygamous households. As I said before, this is a major problem for those of us who work in countries like Senegal. Are these to be considered nuclear or joint households? How is the common pot defined? It is actually impossible to decide ex ante unless you probe the actual relations of interdependence among units. And this requires a lot of probing, a lot of interviewing, which is not what we normally do, especially in large-scale household surveys. In some cases, relatively wealthier households are more likely to be divided into separate conjugal units for consumption purposes, but perhaps they may engage in pooling of labor for production. So again, it really depends on what kind of decision, what sort of research question we have. And I could go on and on some of these problems in this particular case. Let me just move on to the last part of my presentation, which is about what sorts of things we could do to sort of avoid some of these traps. And this is what we tried to do in our more recent research on labor issues in Ethiopia and Uganda. That affects how we design our sampling process, which I use two key words. One, it has to be independent, and it has to be adaptive. Independent from existing conventions and from existing sources of evidence for sampling frame, lists, etc., and also adaptive to make sure that we understand very specific different contexts. So one thing that we need to be very aware of is the possible dichotomy between established residents and migrants in certain areas in which this is an important issue. So how do we capture the mobile and the invisible? We're also going to deal with areas with very different population densities. So different residential units and different household residential patterns, which affects the way enumerators actually identify these places. We are dealing with dynamic, rapidly changing context. So there is a lot of attrition. I've been involved in longitudinal surveys, and when you go back even 1 year, 2 years later, the households have disappeared, or they've split in parts, and it's very hard to make sense of what's going on. Very different forms of accommodation. Very often enumerators go with a very particular mental image of what a household is, what is a compound, and then they go to places when they don't see these will not be enumerated. Okay? So we need to think beyond the household and just get rid of the concept altogether, at least for starters. And of course, you have different forms of poverty, status, and livelihoods. So let me just illustrate with some pictures. So we have heterogeneous context. What is this? This is a small village in rural Ethiopia, okay, with a common pattern that you can find in many villages in that particular area, with residential units, where people live, of these characteristics, with more than one hut. And that is sort of the classic image of the rural household in many parts of Africa, indeed. Okay, so then you can trace this residential unit to one of those places within the village. And usually national household surveys are comfortable in dealing with this kind of situation. They're much less comfortable with dealing with rapidly changing environments, moving into between blurred boundaries between the rural and the urban. This is one of the fastest growing towns in Ethiopia, around Big Flower Farm, you see there. Okay, so this town is very small before, a lot of rural population around, and it's been sort of spreading quite fastly in the last few years. And that's the kind of residential unit that you have in areas like this, of this place, very close to these farms. What are these? Is this like a typical rural compound? No, this is rented accommodation for migrants. So each of these doors for our survey is actually a residential unit. We don't care whether they define it as a household or not. We are going to fully enumerate whoever is sleeping there. Okay? So, what doesn't count as a household, therefore, is a residential unit. So you have a slightly less ideologically charged notion of residential unit. It could be anything, even the RAF. People sleep in the RAF. You go, you look behind compounds, behind actual households, you see rented accommodation. So when you enter a household in this particular area, you will see that all these doors are accommodation for seasonal migrants. And this is a residential unit. 6 male workers sleeping here for a period of 4 to 5 months, sometimes even more, some of them actually spending them there 2 years. None of them related in the sense of being members of the same household. But then you take this as a starting point to construct your household roster. Okay? So that takes me to the other sort of innovation, which is rather than using a residential definition of the household, we use an economic definition of the household. So we target the respondent as a household roster anchor. So let's say, going back to the small room that you saw before, we interview each of these individuals, and we will construct a household roster out of these individuals. Okay? So any kind of residential unit. This leads to step-by-step identification of what we call economically linked individuals, which basically requires quite a lot of careful probing to establish whether there is or there isn't a consistent economic relationship between these people and whoever is mentioned, in terms of contributions, okay, to the common pot, whichever way you want to define it, and also relations of dependence. So obviously, some people would include the usual suspects in the nuclear family, but then you can expand. You can expand that to anyone who might be abroad and who makes consistent contributions to the well-being of this person, and therefore should be part of the household roster. So the implication is that when we apply this sort of methodology, we do actually systematically and consistently capture what wouldn't be normally missing people or absent members. Migrants, long-term migrants, but also seasonal migrants and so on. But also, that allows us to probe the inclusion or not of obvious members. For example, a husband. You go to parts of rural Mozambique, southern Mozambique, where there's a long history of migration to South Africa. You go to a small house in one of the villages, you speak to a woman there, and you ask, so who's the household head? And she will say, he will give the name of the husband. When you start probing, actually, that husband has been away for 30 years, and that woman hasn't had news from this person for the past 10 years. But still, she would say that he is the household head. in our definition, if you probe enough, this person, this husband, will not be included in the household roster because it's meaningless to understand the well-being of this particular person.